All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Everybody, welcome to tonight's program. Alhamdulillah, we're honored to have with us Imam Dawud Walid. Shaykh Dawud, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We're honored to have you with us, Shaykh. Let me just tell our audience a little bit about who you are. So Imam Dawud Walid is currently the executive director of the Michigan chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE. And he's a member of the Michigan Muslim Community Council, MMCC, Imams Committee. He previously served as an imam at Masjid Wali Muhammad in Detroit and the Bosnian American Islamic Center in Hamtramck, Michigan. And he continues to deliver khutbahs and lectures at Islamic centers across the US and Canada. Shaykh Dawood is also co-author of the book Centering Black Narrative, Black Muslim Nobles Among the Early Pious Muslims, as well as another book that came out recently called Towards Sacred Activism, which he has authored himself. I personally got to know Imam Dawood last year as we both spoke at a program in Albany, New York, and we actually stayed together in the same house for a couple of days. What I appreciate about Imam Dawood and what I hope we can benefit from today is his ability to draw from his study and knowledge of the Islamic tradition, as well as his experience and expertise in activism here in America. So once again, thank you, Sheikh, for joining us and sharing with us today. Sheikh, I'm gonna jump right in. I have a series of questions that I wanted to ask you, and hopefully we can use those to have a conversation. As you know, the title of today's program is The Muslim Activist, a conversation on how to ground our activism in Islamic principles. And this is really the discussion of the hour. With the killing of George Floyd, we've seen an immense awakening across the country, a strong response in the wider community as well as in the Muslim community to some long-standing issues in our society, namely the issue of police brutality and racism against the Black community. However, as we know, George Floyd was unfortunately just one of many cases in the United States. There have been so many similar horrible incidents and other expressions of racism in so many aspects of our society. So in many ways, this was not something new. Why do you think, Sheikh, that there was such a strong response at this time?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا دائما أبدا. First of all, Shaykh Arsalan, may Allah bless you and protect you, and also bless the community. And I appreciate this opportunity to discuss this topic at this very pivotal time in American history. Allah knows best about what straw broke the proverbial camel's back in this particular situation. I think that there's been so many issues where people have been caught killing unarmed Black people on camera that maybe people got desensitized to it, but I think there's a couple of things that may be different this time. The first is people have been stuck in their houses for a couple of months before this with the COVID-19 sheltering in place. Many people feel that as if the government has failed them, the system is failing them, and there is a general sense that governance in the United States of America is not serving the interests of humanity for America, but even the world abroad. I think this is one thing on a macro level that's outside of anti-Blackness that needs to be considered. I think the other issue is that it was on camera and the lack of humanity that was shown, in which another human being had their knee on the neck of another human being for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And the nonchalant nature of the police that were around with their hands in their pockets, and from the man saying, "I can't breathe," to calling upon his dead mother for help. I think that the sheer level of savagery that was exhibited by those police officers that were involved in that, I think it just outraged people on a very like fitrawi level, like in the primordial nature of human beings. It's like you don't have to be someone who has extensive history, knowledge of American history, or be a sociologist to see that something like that should not take place anywhere but in the United States of America. American citizens just simply, I think, it's not in a lot of people, just the pure brutality and savagery in regards to how George Floyd was murdered.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Sheikh, I want to, if you don't mind, I want to step back, take a step back from this specific context and zoom out. And I know we're all tired of hearing the word zoom. Zoom out and talk more broadly about activism conceptually and some practical aspects and how we can implement them at this time. So Imam Dawud, how should we look at activism as Muslims? Would you say, is activism considered a religious obligation upon every Muslim to be engaged in activism?
Good question. So Allah Azza wa Jal has told us in the Quran that enjoining good and forbidding evil is a religious obligation. And from the broader perspective is fardun kifaya. So there always has to be a group of people who are fulfilling this obligation. It doesn't mean that every single individual person has to be an activist, but the underpinnings of this is clear in the Quran when Allah Azza wa Jal said, وَتَكُن مِّنكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. And let there be a ta'ifa. It's pronounced, it's literally ummah. Let there be an ummah, but it's a group. And this group has to be organized that calls towards excellence and enjoins what is good and just and forbids that which is bad and unjust. And these will be the successful people. So this is a community obligations, and our scholars of fiqh, Imam Nawawi, and so many others have referenced this ayah of the Quran that have mentioned is a communal obligation. Within this framework of enjoining good and forbidding the evil, we also have a hadith of the Prophet alayhi salam that's on the individual level, but I want to just shed a little light on this because sometimes this is misunderstood. And all of us know this hadith. I think everyone watching this knows this hadith. It is narrated by Imam Muslim rahimahullah and is on the authority of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiallahu anhu, the great Sahabi. And it is that the messenger of God alayhi said that, and whoever of you sees a munkar, and this is something unwholesome or unjust, you change it biyadi, with your hand. And if you cannot, then resist it bilisani, you speak out against it. If you can't do that, then resist it in your heart. But then he said, وَذَلِكَ أَضَعْفُ الْإِيمَانِ, but that's the weakest of faith. So in the context, many of the scholars of hadith, what comes to my mind is Imam Ahmed rahimahullah, who mentioned this, that biyadi, the one who changed it with his hand, means that the one who has the authority to change it, right? So this isn't a hadith that gives justification for vigilantism, right? Like our activism isn't vigilantism. So then if one doesn't have the authority to change it, be they an elected official, someone who's in the political authority, or it could be someone that is like over an organization in which there's some sort of injustice in the organization, then the next one is, if you don't have authority, then you speak out against it, right? You speak out against it. But in some circumstances, people can't speak out against things, right? Because there may be a factor where there's a direct threat to their lives or personal safety, but maybe they can't. Also, those who aren't mukallaf or mukallafa according to the deen, meaning that they haven't reached the age of spiritual responsibility, they're not obligated to do this anyway. But also, many people don't have the knowledge to speak on a particular issue, right? So they shouldn't be the ones speaking out if they don't have knowledge of the situation. But if one can't do that, then they should at the least feel bad in their heart. And this is the general condition of many people. But then the Prophet mentioned these things down that there are different degrees, and he said, but this is the weakest of faith. Now, if a person sees injustice and doesn't even feel bad about it, then that means there's a problem with their Iman. That means that this is a sign of perhaps of a spiritual crisis, to see injustice, right? So the point of it is that everyone doesn't be on the front lines. Everyone can make dua for the musta'afin or for the oppressed. So you make dua, you pray, make dua. Those who can go a step further and have resources, they can donate to the cause of the ta'ifa, of that group that is organized to fight the injustice. Right? So these are things that we all can do, and everyone doesn't have to be everyone doesn't have to protest on the street, or everyone doesn't have to be a political commentator. Most people shouldn't be commenting and giving their independent view about everything. But people can make dua, they can donate, and if they have knowledge of the situation, it can help educate people in their circle of influence, starting in their family.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. So I think what you said leads us into my next question, because so you talked about, enjoining good and forbidding evil, and the ayat that you shared with us about that, and the ahadith that you shared with us about that. And we know that Islam stresses the importance of al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahyu 'anil munkar, which is a concept that's not very different from the concept of activism. However, we also know that enjoining good and forbidding evil has prerequisites that must be fulfilled, and you alluded to some of them. But I would like for you to spend a little bit more time elaborating on this. So what would you say are some of the most important prerequisites for activism for a Muslim that would make a Muslim activist different from a regular activist?
Wonderful. Okay, so part of this, and the starting point is, and we know that our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that actions are by their intentions. So the first of those things should be our intention. So we have a niyyah, or a motive, that we're doing for the sake, for the pleasure of Allah Azza wa Jal. So it all starts off with our motives or our intentions, right? It's not simply for our egos, or simply going by the winds of public opinion, but we do what we do for the sake of Allah. This is the starting point. This is the foundation of everything we should start off at as Muslims, including activism. Beyond that, a prerequisite or of the shurut of enjoining good and forbidding the evil is that one must have knowledge, right? So one must have knowledge. So one of the scholars of the meanings of the word in the Quran, he wrote a very famous book called Mufradat al-Quran, and in this defines al-ma'ruf, and he says that ma'ruf contains two primary characteristics, and then there's afterwards we can derive from the scholars of usul more meaning, but primarily is that which is al-adl wa tayyib, so that which is just, and then that which is wholesome. So that's what we enjoin. And then the opposite of that, the munkar, is that which is dhulm. That's what we're supposed to prohibit it. Injustice, and then also indecency. But what's very important to understand is this issue of al-adl or al-adala, or justice. So al-adl is one of the names of Allah Azza wa Jalla, and it is He who is the one who is translated as he is the just, but this is not a very full explanation. So Allah Azza wa Jalla is the one who set the balance of all things. And he's also the one who put everything in their proper places as he intended them to function in. So this is justice, right? And when people take things outside their proper places, God-given human rights, when they take those things out of their proper places, then this is dhulm or injustice. And I say that we become these definitions for a reason, because some people may advocate for things as a justice issue and say that such and such is an injustice if they don't have certain access to certain things, but it may not be a God-given right. So like justice just isn't simply left up, or our standards of what is good is not just simply left the trends of the winds of public opinion polls. So this requires knowledge, right? And this is a very important prerequisite. And then when we're talking about, and I wrote this in my book, Sacred Activism, is also important in this context that when something is sacred, not only are the means that we are seeking to reach, that must be a righteous goal. Excuse me, the ends. Not only should the ends be a righteous goal, but also the means that we use have to also be appropriate means, never be righteous means, because we as Muslims, we can never say that the ends justify the means. So these are some basic things that we have to know about, basically some general parameters that we must know. We must know general means, and then as Sidi Ahmed Zaruq, he said, as many of Usul have said, that it's not permissible for anyone to proceed in an endeavor until they learn the ruling of Allah pertaining to it, right? Meaning that it is.
Sorry, Sheikh, can you repeat that statement of Sidi Ahmed Zaruq? You broke up a little bit.
Okay.
What did Sidi Ahmed Zaruq say?
So Sidi Ahmed Zaruq, rahmatullah alayhi, said, it is not permissible for anyone to proceed in a matter until they know the ruling of Allah pertaining to it. Again, it is not permissible for anyone to proceed in a matter until they know the ruling of Allah pertaining to it. So if one has not ascertained or sought the scholars, or as the Quran says, if you don't know, ask ahlu dhikr, you ask the people of knowledge. If one does not know the ruling of Allah pertaining to an issue, then the baseline is to sit still and stay silent, to have sukut and stay silent until you learn the ruling. It's not just that one feels that they're compelled to act, because we must act out because everyone else is jumping on the bandwagon or doing this or doing that. We have to know the ruling of Allah pertaining to a specific thing, because, and I was concerned giving a long answer, but we also have this principle in Islamic law that not doing harm takes precedence over giving benefits. So Yahya ibn Mu'adh al-Razi, he made a statement. He says that if one cannot bring benefit, then legal harm, right? So the baseline is, if we don't know what we're doing or clear on the ruling, we don't want to act out of haste, because we may end up doing harm. I mean, firstly, harm to our own selves and our own souls if we're doing something that is haram, or it can even fall into the makruh, that could be dishonorable to Allah. But then we don't want to do harm to other people with, with sincere intentions. We can be sincere, be sincerely wrong. So just being sincere about something related to activism, sincerity is just not enough. Sincerity is just the starting point.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh.
Yeah.
Sheikh, you said something that reminded me of something. Sometimes in our everyday discourse as Muslims, there seems to be a split between what is generally called activism, which is actively working to eradicate oppression. Seems to be a split between that and spirituality. The work of activism is supposed to be hands-on, seeking justice, while spirituality seems to take an attitude of focusing more on worship as a tool for change and relegating true justice to the hereafter. And some people may even feel within themselves a tension between these two aspects of their religious practice. So on the one hand, the work for justice, and on the other hand, a more spiritual surrender to God. And what I wanted to ask you is there really a split here, or is there a congruence that we can find?
Well, we should have a level of congruence, and we know that in the Quran there is a statement that is said over 80 times in the Quran when Allah Azza wa Jal mentions those إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, right? So it's those who believe, and then with their belief, they also do righteous deeds, as Imam Malik said, he said, "El imanu qawlun wal amal." So iman or faith is in speech as well as in deed. So there should be some congruency regarding one's spiritual life being connected to Allah Azza wa Jal, having proper belief and striving to stay connected and having that that ruhaniya, that spirituality, and then also not disconnected to the spirituality as how we live that spirituality out in the world. And this includes justice and being just to ourselves first, but seeking to be just. And if I can mention this as well, that in the Quran, we have 7 different characteristics in the Quran of people that Allah mentions as object of the verb of who he loves. So yuhib, for instance. And we know that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wa sahbihi wasallam is the one who perfected all of those makarim al-akhlaq, all those noble traits of character. So there's 7 of these. So Allah Azza wa Jal says, Inna Allaha yuhibbu muqsitin, right? So Allah loves the people of justice, right? This is something that's noble. If we are just ourselves and we are seeking to be just and to spread justice in the land. But again, it goes back to those prerequisites that we mentioned earlier regarding the other question that you asked, Sheikh.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. So let me come back to that question and expound on that a little bit more. And I know, one of the things that's really emphasized in our tradition is adab in everything that we do. Even in your book, Towards Sacred Activism, the cover of the book, mashallah, has that beautiful Turkish calligraphy, adab yahu. But on social media, in some circles especially, we see some people being very dismissive and critical of adab. When someone is reminded to do things with adab, they're told that they overemphasize adab and are overly concerned with adab, or that it's a cop-out to try to make things sound nice and not taking a firm stance or speaking clearly on things. What are your thoughts on this, Sheikh?
Well, if we are doing what we are doing for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal and not for our own nafs, then it would require adab. And we should never be dismissive of adab, because adab is a sign of learning. Adab is a sign of spiritual refinement. And adab is necessary in all aspects of life. And, our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he made more prayers than all of us, but Allah Azza wa Jal didn't praise him for his salah, right? What did Allah Azza wa Jal praise him for? وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَىٰ خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, that he was established upon the most magnificent character, and he demonstrated this, right? So we as activists, and I include myself as one of those, or community organizers, and I consider myself one of those as well, that it's foolish for us to think that we are going to be successful in our endeavors, but ignore the adab and the means of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And my friend Dr. Bilal Ware mentioned this, may Allah preserve him. He says that if we leave the sunnah and akhlaq of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the endeavor that we do, he said that we're all alone. In other words, we should expect Allah's help. We're on our own, and good luck with that, right? I mean, we shouldn't even expect it. And one example I mentioned in the book, for those who say adab doesn't matter. Fir'aun in the Quran is mentioned as the archetype of a human oppressor. He is the archetype of a human oppressor as mentioned in the Quran. And two of the greatest men on earth at that time were commanded to speak truth to the worst man on earth. Those two best men were Musa alayhi salam wa Harun alayhi salam. So the two best were commanded to speak to the worst, right? The worst of the worst. And the command of Allah Azza wa Jal, when he told those two prophets to go speak to Fir'aun, the worst of the worst, Allah Azza wa Jal commanded them to do it with adab. فَقُولُ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرُ أَوْ يَخْشَىٰ. Those two prophets were commanded, and go speak to Fir'aun in a mild tone, lest he may remember or fear, fear Allah. So they weren't given permission to cuss him out or call him names or shout him down or start throwing things at him, right? That wasn't the adab that Allah Azza wa Jal prescribed. Even though this guy was the worst of the worst, he enslaved people based upon racism. He was a murderer, and he was the ultimate narcissist. Right? And I'm no high Lord. Even 45 in the Oval Office didn't even say that, right? So he's like the worst of the worst. Yet those prophets were commanded to go and do al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar with beautiful comportment, beautiful manners. So for those who doubt speaking to oppressors and say, well, we don't need adab, well, I would say this, open the Quran and read the story of Musa and Harun.
Going back to the topic of the prerequisites for activism, in your book, Towards Sacred Activism, you talk about another prerequisite, which you call summoning moral courage. And I feel like this is a really important point that reminds us to be brave and stand firm in our efforts. But you also say in your book that courage is not recklessness. Can you talk about this a little bit, especially in light of the recent protests?
Yeah, well, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, mentioned about this, that there are two extremes. So the one extreme is on the left, we can say the far left is el-jubn. This is cowardice, right? When one becomes arrested by fear of people, a fear of principalities of the dunya. The other one is recklessness, when there's absolutely no caution that is being that takes place whatsoever. That someone runs in and with absolutely no limits and no sense of caution, right? So these are two extremes. As shaja'a, or moral courage, or courage, is in the middle. So courage does not mean the absence of any fear coming to someone, right? That's not what courage means. What courage is struggling past that fear of people, or struggling past that fear of not being accepted, and replacing that fear of creation for fear of the creator. And when one is operating based upon that, then that would be one who then is summing up moral courage. You know, what's really interesting is that in a prophetic hadith, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is seeking refuge from certain things. And I think the order of this is very interesting, where in one particular dua, he says, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-bukhli wal jubn, right? That he said, oh God, I seek refuge with you from stinginess and cowardice, right? And this has a lot to do with cowardice about speaking up, relating to injustices, right? So on the one hand, you have people who don't want to speak up about injustice, but this relates back to a level of relating to the stinginess that actually comes before, because when someone's stingy, it is a absence of surety or yaqeen that Allah is ar-razaq and he's the one that actually gave them what they have. So they hold on tightly and don't want to share anything, thinking that that's going to hold on to that which they have is going to preserve it, right? So they don't give. And then if someone is scared of losing their dunya that much, then that will lead them to being a coward, right? Likewise, someone who is reckless won't have any sort of wisdom, won't try to make any preparations, and they will run in headfirst without putting forth any thought, without having any hikmah or any wisdom in how they do it. And that's not courageous. That's foolish. That's reckless. That's foolish. So we don't want to fall into any of those. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاسِطًا. Allah Azza wa Jalla says they are the people to take the middle route. So not cowardice nor recklessness, and that's what we seek to be a people of moral courage, and we should pray for that, and we should seek refuge from being cowards, and we should also seek refuge from being reckless. We should seek refuge from both of those.
Yeah, Shaykh, and if I can also share here something that my Shaykh would always remind his students of in their efforts towards da'wah, which is to think deeply about the probable consequences of their actions and how due deliberation and weighing the probable consequences is an essential part of the prophetic sunnah. Instead of doing something which may give us an immediate feeling of gratification, but no real benefit long term, we should be visionary, strategic, and farsighted, or as Imam Zayd put it in one of his recent talks, plan through the pain, plan through the pain. But Shaykh, that brings me to my next question. Many people say, I know you briefly alluded to this in one of your previous answers, but I just wanted to give you some time to talk about this a little bit more. Many people say that we must do whatever it takes to see meaningful change in society, especially when these results are so critically important. And some would invoke the famous quote of Malcolm X, by any means necessary. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, our beloved Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, rahmatullahi ta'ala, when he's talking about by any means necessary, and we should look at this within the framework of our spiritual tradition. So we look at it between any means that is acceptable according to the Quran and Sunnah. So it's by any means necessary, and then we add on the addendum or in brackets, that is acceptable according to the Quran and the Sunnah, because Allah Azza wa Jalla doesn't love the mu'tadeen. He doesn't love the people who transgress the boundaries and transgress the limits of the sacred law. So we can never be a people that say that the ends justify the means. And if we take on that attitude of just saying that the ends justify the means, that we don't care about the means, we may think that in reaching a goal that we are bringing about some good, but in fact, we may be infusing more toxicity into the society and to begin to stir up even a greater fitna than the actual issue that we are advocating to try to change. I think we have to be very careful about that. And we see some examples about this, right, throughout human history, where there are actually people who did things and they transgressed certain limits or boundaries and end up causing more problems. So may Allah protect us from that. But we are a people, as I also believe I've heard Imam Zayd say before, and he actually wrote the foreword to the book to Activism, Allah. But we are people of substance and form. As Muslims, we're supposed to be a people of substance, but also form. So we are supposed to be a people to seek righteous ends, and we're supposed to strive for ihsan or spiritual beauty in the process. So the ends can never justify the means. So if we look at Malcolm's saying today, again, I say this in the year 2020, it should be by any means necessary within the boundaries of the Quran and the Sunnah.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. I'm going to change the topic a little bit and ask you a different question. So we hear a lot of talk about allyship and being an ally to others and working communally with other organizations and institutions. Sheikh, how do we do this in a principled way if there are some fundamental things on which we disagree?
That's a good question. Well, I don't like to get overly caught up in terminologies because the principles perhaps are more important than terms. But I would say I think this term allyship has been misused in Muslim circles. And if we can take a step back, I like to mention in my conception the difference between those who are allies and those who we can work with in the coalition. So Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions in the Quran the term awliya, and awliya has more than one meaning, but one of the meanings is allies. And Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions in the Quran al-mu'minun al-mu'minat ba'duhum awliya'u ba'd, that believing men and believing women are allies of one another. And then Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions 5 characteristics of those people who are in allyship with, and those in which allegiance is with. And we're talking about from a spiritual perspective. Spiritual allegiance relates to those who have a common belief and agree upon certain transcendent values and transcendent beliefs that are based in objective truth, like not believing that everything is subjective, that there is such thing as objective truth, right? Those are allies, right? And we've been warned in the Quran about not taking people who don't believe as allies over believers. Why? Because there's a different starting point that we're going from. Now, one may be aligned with someone or a group on 75%, 80% issues, and those are coalition partners, right? And we can be in coalition with them with certain considerations. Now, one of the basis of this that we have is the story of the Prophet alayhi salam when he was a younger man and he witnessed something called the virtuous treaty, or Hulful Fudul. And in this virtuous treaty, he witnessed, and the occasion of this is it was a man who was not a resident of Mecca, who was cheated in a business deal. He cried out that he was oppressed, and then some of the men in Mecca got together and they made a treaty that no one would be taken advantage of and cheated in Mecca, which was an area of commerce. The Prophet ﷺ was a witness to this, and he made the comment that this was more beloved to me than the best red camels. And then he said, if I were called to this in Islam, I would accept. I would answer, I would accept. Now, he was asked about this by the Sahaba. So we can glean from this, and these people that entered into this agreement, they weren't on Islam. They were polytheists, right? So the goal was righteous, right? So if that goal conforms with our goal. It doesn't mean that in the process that we affirm all of the beliefs of those people, but that we are seeking a same goal for the common good of society. But it doesn't mean affirming that which we don't believe in the process. Now, Allah Azza wa Jal gives us an ayah of the Quran that is used as a principle for us as Muslims that we can also use of dealing with people who aren't Muslims. And that is in Surah Al-Ma'idah, where Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَتَعَوْنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى وَلَا تَعَوْنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. We cooperate and help people. We help one another based upon piety and righteousness, but we don't cooperate and help people on issues that relates to that which is sinful and that which is forbidden, and then that which also disrespects the remembrance of Allah Azza wa Jal, because al-udwan is the semantical opposite to at-taqwa in this ayah, right? So those are kind of like the boundaries. So yes, we can enter into coalitions with people who don't believe in Islam, who are Jewish people, Christian people, even atheists, right, on certain issues. And we don't have to agree with all of their lifestyle, much less all of their beliefs. But the consideration is, number one, is the cause compliant with our secret law? Number two, is it just about the issue, or are we being asked to promote something else with promoting that, with seeking that issue? Which in that case, if that's intertwined with that issue, then we're not permitted to promote something that is hateful in the sight of Allah Azza wa Jalla, right? And then we should also have our own language or nomenclature and our own independent means. In other words, it is not upon us that we have to copy what us or says in regards to meaning the same objective. You don't have to use the exact same nomenclature or the exact same tactics, because maybe some of the things they say or do maybe don't coincide with our adab or don't coincide with our sharia.
Sheikh, yeah, just related to what you were saying at the very end here. I remember a few years ago, you wrote an article that was published by Iman Wire, in which you drew a distinction between Black Lives Matter as a concept versus a specific organization with that title. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I wrote an article about that for Iman Wire 4 years ago, and then I wrote something else recently in the last week and a half about the same thing. So I think it's important for us as a community to distinguish between three things, and we need precision, right? When we do things, we have to operate from knowledge, not just follow trends. There's a distinction between Black Lives Matter, the slogan and its origin, to people who protest on the streets that some people say is a Black Lives Matter protest, then the actual organization called Black Lives Matter. These are three different entities. The slogan Black Lives Matter started in 2012 and actually had nothing to do with a police officer killing an unarmed Black person. In 2012 is when a African-American honor roll student, teenager, Trayvon Martin, was killed by vigilante George Zimmerman. And there was non-action being taken about that case from the prosecutor's office, and people started hashtagging Black Lives Matter to bring attention to Trayvon Martin case. This is the genesis of Black Lives Matter slogan, and all it means is that Black lives should matter in this system, because in reality, Black lives have never equaled the same as white lives in American society historically. It's all it means. Doesn't mean that other people's lives don't matter, right? That's all Black Lives Matter means as a slogan or a mantra. Then a couple years later, Mike Brown, another African-American teenager just graduated from high school, was killed by the Ferguson police. He also was unarmed. And then people started protesting, and Black Lives Matter became reinvigorated as a slogan for those protests. Then after that, a organization was founded called Black Lives Matter that had been funded by over $100 million. The seed money for the starting of it did not come from the grassroots Black American community. It came from certain so-called progressive foundations, far left-leaning foundations. And they also had what was called an intersectional agenda, right? Because the three founders who got funding were Black American lesbians, right? So then in this organization, they weaved in LGBTQ issues with, as they consider their intersectional identities, with police brutality and killing of Black people and mass incarceration, right? Which those two things are not one and the same historically, nor are what they're advocating is not just the protection of people getting bullied or killed because of hate crimes, but part of their program, as you can see on their website, is the destruction of what they call heteronormativity, right? This is one thing. Also, they call for destruction of the nuclear family. So many things that the organization promotes aren't wrong, and many of the solutions that they come towards, I personally don't agree. I mean, I personally don't disagree with all the things they're saying. So a number of the things they say and solutions, I actually, at least political solutions, right? I have agreement with, but the distinction is, I don't suggest for Muslims to give financial donations to an organization, number one, that's well funded by outsiders anyway, and now corporations are giving them. But number two, I don't suggest that any Muslim donates to an organization that is involved in El Amru bil Munkar. That's exactly what Black Lives Matter is doing. And there's enough other grassroots organizations, start with Muslim organizations that are led by Black folks who are Muslim, who work on these issues of organizing police accountability, or to help strengthen African American communities within the Muslim community in general. And there's also some other grassroots issues or organizations working on the ground that are Black, that have been around long before Black Lives Matter. They've been working on these issues, right? So supporting Black people and supporting Black Lives Matter, they're not one and the same. They've been overly conflated. Like, supporting Black Lives Matter doesn't mean supporting Black people necessarily, and vice versa. And all Black people, just because they go in the streets to protest against police brutality out of historical pain, doesn't mean that all of those people know about the Black Lives Matter organizational platform, much less support it. So I think those are some caveats, those are some pieces of information that we have to understand. And just personally, from a position of wara, I don't hashtag Black Lives Matter on any of my social media posts. I used to, until about 4 or 5 years ago, when I found out some of these things in their agenda that I found to be from the Mungarat. That's when I stopped myself using Black Lives Matter hashtag, so I don't even use it. I don't use it.
SubhanAllah, that's really interesting, Sheikh. Thank you for being so upfront about that. Jazakallah khair. Sheikh, you said at the beginning that you wrote an article 4 years ago for Iman Wire, but recently, like about a week ago, you wrote another piece. Where can we find that piece, and what is it called?
Both of those are on Iman Wire, and it was posed as a question. It was, should Muslims support Black Lives Matter? I believe that's the title. I'm looking up right now, should Muslims support?
You're talking about the one that was published recently, like about a week ago?
Yeah, the one that was published recently. It is, that was on Iman Wire. Let me type up, looking right now. and you might want to share it in the chat. Let's see here. It's titled "An Answer to Should Muslims Support Black Lives Matter." It was published 8 days ago.
Perfect.
But I've talked about this number of times over the years on the Mad Mamluks podcast and a number of different platforms. I've gone into this before. There's a video of me talking about this on YouTube as well, and I also had written something 4 years ago relating to this issue of Black Lives Matter that can also be found on the on Iman Wire.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. I know we just have a few minutes left and it's going to be Maghrib time soon in where you are. So let me just maybe ask you 2 or 3 more questions and then we can wrap it up, inshallah. Shaykh, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you and preserve you. You've been working in this field for a long time, in the field of da'wah, in the field of activism. I'm sure you have faced many frustrations on the way, many roadblocks, many setbacks. What have you personally found that has helped you, and how would you advise people who become involved in this work not to get burned out?
Okay, so there's 3 things that I would like to say is that one, that I try my best to stick to my dhikr. So it's one thing, and to stick to my dhikr after Fajr prayer and after Maghrib, and also within this to try to do as much as-salatu ala nabi as I can. I try to do 1,000 times a day as-salatu ala nabi. So this is one thing, to try to stay connected, and to this helps with taking away worries and anxieties. So
Shaykh, 1,000 times salat ala nabi. Shaykh, what do you say exactly 1,000 times?
Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad al-Fatih lima ughliq wa khatim lima sabaq nasib al-haq bil-haq wa hadi ila siratikal mustaqim wa ala alihi haqqan qadri miqdar al-azim. O Allah, send salat upon our master Muhammad, the one who opened that which was previously closed, and the one who sealed that which came before, the helper of truth with the truth, and a guider to your straight path, and upon his family, the rightful measure which is due to his magnificence. It's also known as Salat al-Fatih, right? There's shorter ways to do it. Sometimes I mix up, and sometimes I will switch it up and do Salat al-Ibrahimiyya, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim, or I just shorten it according to the one of the ways that Abdul Qadir Jilani used to say, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sallam. But I try to do this in some sort of formula about 1,000 times a day. The other thing is that I have a murabbi. I have a spiritual mentor. And we went back to Musa. When I mentioned Musa alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam was one of the steadfast messengers of God who was determined, one of ulul azm min al-rusul. And he's the one that led the movement of challenging Fir'aun. It's mentioned in Surah Kaf that Musa had a spiritual guide. We know him as Al-Khidr alayhi salam, right? So every activist should have a spiritual mentor or a spiritual guide. If one of God's prophets needed one, and good God, who are we to think that we don't need a spiritual mentor or guide? So I have a spiritual mentor. Prior to COVID-19, I would go and meet with him at least once a week and sit down and check in with my sheikh to talk with him. And also it's good for the nafs, for the ego, right? To do khidmah and to check in with your spiritual mentor. The other thing I think is also very important is our companionship, who we keep company with. Who do we give our ears to? Who do we listen to? So we need to be around positive, uplifting suhbah, right? So we have to be in some sort of circles and some sort of groups of people that are helping to help nourish us, because this tradition has been passed down from a person with a healthy hal or spiritual state to another, right? And the spiritual states of the children of Adam affect each other in positive and negative ways. So I try to keep company as much as I can and sit with particular type of people who are positive, people themselves who are people of dhikr, people who read the Quran, and I I uh, work I work in certain spaces and around a lot of activists, and I come in contact with a lot of activists who aren't Muslims, but I try to I work in that world, but I don't live in that world, right? Because if I live in that world, that might take me or drive me to nihilism, right? And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of Muslim activists get burned out, and it's directly related to their suhbah. They fall into states of despair, anxiety, or they want to default and take the easier, softer route. They think the easier and softer route by neglecting the Sharia, by neglecting adab, and thinking they're getting social justice, and it just continues to further and further and further frustrate them. And just as a reminder to those who are watching, this dunya is Dar ibtila. It's the abode of trials and tests. And perfect justice is only in akhirah. This abode is not meant to be just comfort, nor is it meant to be the place where we see perfect justice. So we also have to keep this in mind, and we strive for justice, but at the same time, we know that this abode is a place of tests, and we're never going to see perfect justice in this dunya. You shouldn't expect it, right? And even on the day of judgment, we're not going to want Allah to judge us 100% by what we did. Like we're going to be seeking rahmah from Allah. We're not going to be seeking divine justice for every single. If Allah's rahmah wasn't upon us, all of us would go to hellfire, right? If we were judged based upon our sins and our wrongs, right? So we just have to keep that in mind. But those are three things that I have implemented in my life over the years that has helped me out. It's not saying I don't get frustrated. Sometimes I do. I'm a human being. I'm not from the Ahab, right? I don't, not some, guy who just like, I'm not totally detached from everything. I get affected by things. I get frustrated at times, but when I feel myself getting that way, then I increase my reading of Quran. I increase my dhikr. I get more of my shaykh when I start getting frustrated. So that's what I do, and that has helped me out quite a bit over the years.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. Just maybe one or two more questions, and then we can wrap up, inshallah. Shaykh, I'd like to hear your take on protests specifically. In one of your talks, you mentioned that protest was not a big focus of earlier American Muslim movements, such as that of Malcolm X and others. What then was their model for activism?
Well, some of the early people, Malcolm, when he was in the Nation of Islam and afterwards, didn't really protest much. They did have some protest, and they did hold public rallies, obviously, but protesting for change was not their major focus, nor Imam Wafdi Muhammad, rahmatullahi alayhi. That was not his major focus, right? Although there was room for protesting. So like, for instance, we'll talk about Malcolm. I'll mention one of Malcolm X's most famous protests, and then I'll shift to something else. So Malcolm in 1957, and this was depicted in the Spike Lee movie, Malcolm led a protest against the New York City Police Department. And this relates to a member of the Nation of Islam who was brutally beaten by the New York Police Department. And Malcolm organized a protest in front of the precinct there in Harlem, New York. Right now, number one, they were the organizers of the protest. They weren't joining someone else's protest. Number two, they had their own security for the protests, and they controlled the tenor of the protest. So they also had security. Now, after Malcolm was able to get that man released, this then resulted later on in a lawsuit that brought forth the largest settlement in the history of New York City regarding a police brutality case, right? So there was protesting and there was use of the law, but part of what they focused more on was transformation, right? And of people. And the reality of it is that racism can't be protested away. This is a tool, right? This is a tool that's used in some limited occasions. Even laws can't take away racism or punishments. Punishments can act as deterrents. You can have laws in the book, but at the heart of it, racism is a spiritual, is a manifestation of spiritual maladies. So spiritual maladies can't be marched away, or they can't be legislated and adjudicated away. So the movement of Malcolm X, he was talking about, especially once he left the nation and he came back from Hajj, he offered people a path towards transformation and redemption. Imam Wafdi Muhammad rahmatullahi ta'ala also talked about offering a path of transformation first to the mazloom, to the oppressed, right? About ways that they can empower themselves and rid themselves from fear, and to have self-confidence, not inferiority complexes, and more healthy ways of viewing themselves first, and then offering a path of redemption and to address people of the dominant culture. And this also is the dawah. So I believe in 2020, and this may sound counterintuitive to some people, I don't think street protests are the most important thing that we need to be involved in right now. I think that right now, Americans feel frustrated. The sports industry and the team owners have failed them. Their entertainers have failed them. Hollywood has failed them. Their political leaders have failed them. Even the church has failed them. Everything has failed them, right? So people are frustrated on the streets. And you see white Americans, some of them who are the descendants of slave masters, tearing down statues of racists, or we can even call these like socio-political idols in American society. So they're pulling down these societal idols who are white supremacists. And if I can make an analogy, that the idols were busted up at the Kaaba by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also Bilal and Usama ibn Zayd, two black men, went into the Kaaba with him and to help break the idols. Then Bilal went on top of the Kaaba and called the adhan, right? He called the people towards proper worship. And I truly believe that as there's societal change taking place and the idols of white supremacy are being busted up, I think we need to go back to what Malcolm said, that if white Americans accepted Islam or studied Islam, that then we could help solve the race problem in America. I think that Muslims need to be about dawah right now in 2020. I think we need to be about giving people solutions and a path to redemption for America by calling them to the spiritual teachings of Islam. This is what I believe. I believe 2020 is the year for dawah. That's what I believe.
SubhanAllah. That's really interesting, Sheikh. Jazakallah khair.
Yeah.
Sheikh, I'll make this the final question, inshallah. In the past few weeks, we have seen many masajid, many Islamic institutions around the country making statements against racism. We've seen a flurry of programs on racism in the Muslim community, discussing how to address it from many different perspectives. And we've seen more attention and platforms given to African American teachers and scholars in the last few weeks as we navigate these issues. On the one hand, one can see this as a positive step and something that's long overdue and shamefully overdue, but a positive step nevertheless. But on the other hand, though, there are those who say that this is only being done for social currency.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
I would say that there's two things that we need to factor in. I think that number one, Muslims should incline towards having husnul dhan, a good opinion about their brothers and sisters in Islam, unless overtly said otherwise about their intentions about why they're doing things, and that being prophetic is providing sab'in udhran, or 70 excuses, many excuses for our brothers and sisters. So for those who are saying that it's optimistic, or for all, not optimistic, opportunistic, that I would say that in this time of transformation throughout our country, that we should try to afford people the benefit of the doubt, and to help encourage more allyship amongst believers in Islam. So this is my perspective. I'm not one of those who's trying to dissuade people from these conversations. On the other hand, I also want people to check their intentions, right? So are we really sincere about this for the sake of Allah, or are we doing this just because we believe that this is just one moment and everyone's talking about race, but then are we going to go back to business as usual 3 months from now, perhaps, if there's no more protests on the street and something else becomes popular or becomes trendy on the news, or if COVID-19 has a huge spike again, and then everyone gets put back in sheltering in place, and then we forget about all of these things. I think that is the challenge, both for that there's a challenge, just as the other one, we should be inclining towards giving excuses. I think it's also we need to check our intentions and make sure that we are actually sincere. And if we're sincere, then we're going to take a plan, and a strategic plan to address these issues on various levels, right? And so that's my take on it, Sheikh.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Once again, for those who have been joining this talk late, we mentioned at the very beginning of the talk that Imam Dawood is somebody who has written several works related to what we're talking about. So please do take a look at his books. He's co-author of the book Centering Black Narrative, Black Muslim Nobles Among the Early Pious Muslims. And the more recent book that he authored, which is an excellent piece. It's not very big in size, but it's a very important conversation that we need to be having in our communities. And that book is called Towards Sacred Activism. And then he also talked about something that he wrote recently as about a week or so ago on Iman Wire, and it's called In Answer to Should Muslims Support Black Lives Matter. I think that's a very important piece to look at as well. And he has a bunch of programs that he's been doing over the past month or so. As he was telling me before we went on air, Sheikh, you haven't left the house except a couple of times because of how busy you've been with all these internet programs. Right, Sheikh?
Yeah, I've only left a few times, but alhamdulillah, this is a chance, and with difficulty there's ease, and with calamities come opportunities. So we're thankful for Allah that He has blessed us to live in this time, and may Allah Azza wa Jal increase us all in beneficial knowledge, and may He increase us all in afiyah, that we may stand up and do the task that is needed for this very important time in the history of America and the world.
Ameen. Ameen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you, preserve you and your family. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase you in all that is khair and protect you from all that is shar. Thank you once again, Imam Dawood, for giving us of your precious time, your valuable time, and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you to our listeners, to our viewers. I hope that this was beneficial and a good reminder and informative for all of us. Jazakumullahu khairan. Inshallah, we'll end by saying Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصل اللهم وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق معلن الحق بالحق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.